introduce you to our first speaker. She will, of course, be well known to most of you. That is Linda Doran, who lectures in medieval history in UCD, who has been a long-time supporter of and contributor to the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, particularly on the town of New Ross. You'll be familiar with the Atlas of New Ross, which was published, the Pocket Atlas of New Ross, which was published some years ago. But of course, Linda has worked on many other towns and places and settlements generally across medieval Ireland. So without further ado, to speak on New Ross, Linda Doran.
Thank you very much. You're welcome to this paper. What I'd like to do here is to talk about the town of New Ross as an economic hub for the development of the medieval lordship of Leinster. And really, it is all in the name. This is from 1210. This is from a letter of King John, as he's coming from Carrick and kind of spending a night or two in New Ross. And he addresses it from the bridge, the new town of William Marshall. So it tells us that the town has a bridge, that it's newly founded, and that it's kind of founded by a man who's really famous at the period. This is William Marshall in the Temple Church in London. I don't know if people have been to the Temple Church in London, but it's kind of well worth a visit. He's one of the most kind of eminent soldiers and courtiers of the day. He's sort of like George Clooney, but really good at tournaments. And he is inherits the Lordship of Leinster through his marriage to Isabel de Clare. She was mentioned earlier when we were talking about Clonmines. She's the granddaughter of Diarmaid MacMurrough and the daughter of Richard Fitzgilbert Strongbow and Aoife, the daughter of Diarmaid MacMurrough. They're married in 1289 and he comes into Leinster, lands in Wales and lands in France in 1199. And kind of under their stewardship, a string of market settlements are developed by the followers of William Marshall up along the navigable Barrow and Nore rivers. And the produce of those manors, as well as the produce of religious houses, such as Graig-na-Manna, come down along those rivers and down along the Sliabh Cualann, which runs along the side of the navigable river, and are exported through New Ross, essentially kind of bypassing the port, the Royal Port of Waterford. And that only works because there is a bridge at New Ross. The very first notice we have of New Ross is in a life of William Marshall. So one of the reasons we know a lot about William Marshall is because his son, William Marshall the Younger, commissions a life of his father. And it's begun around 1224 and finished around about 1226. So it's kind of relatively contemporary because William Marshall dies in 1219. And actually, strangely, it's really good on kind of interpersonal relationships. So we get a nice picture of him and his uncle and also of the marriage of him and Isabella. But it's the new town, or it's just referred to as the new town, is raided in 1207 by William Marshall's nemesis, Mylor Fitzhenry. So we don't really know, just tells us that it's a new town, so it's newly founded. Our first sort of notable mention of the bridge is in 1208, when there's a grant to Tintern Abbey. And Tintern Abbey, which is founded by Isabel and William, daughter house of Tintern in Wales, where Isabel and her mother Aoife are buried. And that grant is located off the bridge. So we know that the bridge is there. It's probably been there for quite some time at this period. And our next reference is that one we looked at the start, which is in 1210, and King John is writing his letter, and he mentions the bridge, and he mentions the new town, and he mentions William Marshall. So if we just have a quick look at that on a map there. So those little black dots, they're market settlements up along the navigable Nore, but also most prominently up along the Barrow. Most of those are land granted by William Marshall to his followers, or by the Marshalls to their followers. There had been earlier grants by Isabel's father, Strongbow, but really the bulk of that is from the Marshalls. So New Ross begins as an integral part of the economic exploitation of the Lordship of Leinster. So just to get your eye in on that map there, the area is known as the Carlow Corridor. So it covers the navigable Barrow, the Nore, and the Sliabh Cualann. And if you look at the map at the bottom, that little map of Ireland there, that'll kind of focus you in on where you are. New Ross has no castle, so it's really quite a strategically important location. So in the 1640s, for example, it's occupied by Cromwell. So there could have been a choice there to go for the kind of military aspect, but instead they went for its economic importance. So there's no castle, as the late John Bradley pointed out. And the bridge is vital to linking the capital at Kilkenny with what is going on in the Barrow Valley. Ross is at the lowest in the medieval period, a narrowest point on the Barrow where it's possible to construct a bridge. And the produce of all of those manors, as I've just said, is exported down the rivers through New Ross. It's an organised and it's an integrated system, and it's very probably in place from quite early on in the Marshal Lordship. William Marshal is exiled in Ireland from 1207 to 1213. So probably the bulk of that organisation, which was done by his officials, is perhaps done during that period. Just to kind of zone in a little bit on what I've just said there. There's New Ross, there's Waterford just below it. This is the caput of the manor at Kilkenny. The military infrastructure is at Carlow. So the castle at Carlow protecting the traffic coming down along the Barrow. And there's New Ross, forming that kind of triangle of the administration, the military, and the commercial. This is a reconstruction of Carlow Castle, commissioned by Carlow County Council. And I'm probably, with most people, I'm always a bit iffy about these. They look really lovely, but they're, you know, so perfect. They kind of give us a snapshot in time. This is part of the walls of Kilkenny there. So New Ross is, in the medieval period, an outport to the Marshal Caput at Kilkenny. And it's linked to what the economic kind of exploitation going on by the bridge. The traffic along the Barrow is controlled by that castle at Carlow. This is a map of what the town would have looked like in the 17th century. So it gives you a kind of a feeling of the town. The town is walled in 1267. It's not a greenfield site when the Marshals arrive, because it's the location of an early Christian monastery founded by St. Abban. While I'm not suggesting this is Clonmacnoise, it's not a non-important monastery either. Traditionally, it's sited in John Street, which I'll show you on the map at the moment, near the North Gate, which is adjacent to where the Sliabh Cualann, that kind of roadway that runs down along the Barrow Valley, comes into the town. And it's in the northern section of the town, where we think that monastery is located, that the Marshal town develops, focused on the bridge and on the parish church. So if we just look at that, that's where I think St. Abban's is. There's the Sliabh Cualann coming in along and crossing the river, initially by ferry and then eventually by bridge when the bridge is there. There's the bridge, and there's St. Mary's medieval parish church. Still very beautiful if anybody wants to visit it. It's in ruins at the moment, but really gorgeous. Again, founded by Isabel and William. So that northern part of the town, based on the bridge, is where it develops. The creation of Ross is kind of quite devastating to the local, other local towns. Wexford, but Waterford in particular, both of which are early Norse foundations. Waterford with widespread trading contacts both in Britain and also on the continent. With the coming of the Marshals and their negotiation primarily with John to allow merchants to bypass the royal port of Waterford, kind of unbelievable, and sail right into New Ross. Merchants can sail up those two navigable rivers. So it's really attractive for them without having to sidetrack into Waterford. This creates intense rivalry between the two towns. It goes on for about 200 years. It's graced by things like long petitions, counter petitions, court cases, charters. And as the late Billy Colfer pointed out, if you're forbidding something constantly, it means it's not working. So clearly people were choosing to sail into Ross. Just to give you a flavour of some of the complaints, this is a petition by the men of Waterford following a kind of rearguard action by the men of New Ross. It says, divers citizens of the said city of Waterford charge and load divers boats with hides and merchandise in divers places within the county of Kilkenny and Carlow. That is to say, in Thomastown, Inishtig and St. Mullins, and their boats so laden come down by the two rivers of the Nore and the Barrow, passing very near to the town of Ross. The sovereign Portreeves and commons of the said town take with force and arms, keep and imprison them until they paid great sums of money and fines and customs. I think that's called piracy. Not to be outdone, the men of Waterford subsequently raid New Ross. There are numerous different raids on the towns by each other. But in one of the raids, they take the mace, which of course is the civil authority for New Ross. This is very serious. And the mace still remains in the museum in Waterford, kind of a sore point in New Ross. That petition, interestingly, is after the split up of the Marshall Estates in 1247. So those places mentioned there, Inishtig, Thomastown and St. Mullins, are all founded by the followers of William Marshall. And that network of towns is vital to the success of medieval New Ross. After 1247, when the Marshalls failed to produce a male heir and the estate is split multiple ways, New Ross goes with Carlow and is under the Biggins, the Earls of Norfolk, and Rosbercon on the other side of the river, on the western side, goes with Kilkenny and becomes part of the declared lordship of Kilkenny. So the kind of raison d'etre for Ross ceases to exist. It ceases to be a single lordship with Ross as its port, and Rosbercon, just there on the other side of the river, becomes the outport for Kilkenny. So just to finish up, these are the Ross tapestries. I don't know if people have seen Ross tapestries. They were commissioned in 2008 to commemorate the kind of first reference we have to the bridge. They've currently got a new home in the quay in New Ross, but they're absolutely stunning. This shows the fair at New Ross. New Ross was not a greenfield site when this site was pointed out to Marshall, perhaps by Isabella. It was developed as a commercial enterprise. The bridge is a vital component. The whole thing doesn't work unless you have a bridge. And a bridge, of course, in the medieval period is a tremendous undertaking, really kind of very significant undertaking. It's a strategically important location, but it has no castle. Also, the town is not enclosed until the mid-13th century, till 1267, when it looks like more of a prestige project than a really kind of pressing need. So the town has quite a benign relationship with its hinterland. And this happens when the town is slipping into decline. And perhaps summing up the kind of entrepreneurial spirit of New Ross, a poem is commissioned to commemorate this event. These are the Marshalls lying in their tombs in the Temple Church in London. This is reconstruction of New Ross, and what I want you maybe to note here is that the bulk of the settlement there is focused on the bridge. So it's in the northern section of the town. And probably what's really noticeable is the amount of green field sites there is around it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Linda, for that wonderful paper on New Ross and the importance of the bridge there. So our second paper now in this session is by John Martin, and many of you will be familiar with John's atlas on Dungarvan that was published 5 years ago in 2020. You might not know that there is another publication soon coming from the hand of John, and that is on Dalkey in North County Dublin. So we're looking forward to that later this year being published by Wordwell. John's going to speak to us about Dungarvan and the importance of water and the sea there.
Good morning. In this talk, I'm going to talk about the role of water in the guise of the sea, the river, and drinking water. The Anglo-Normans captured Waterford city in 1170, and they very quickly moved westwards to conquer new lands. If the adventurers had come over the pike in Dungarvan, whilst following the modern road, they would have seen this wide bay opening out, and they would have moved on then towards the estuary itself, which is a surprisingly small river, the River Colligan. It comes from the mountains there to the north, and it doesn't produce enough volume to generate, clear out, give any depth for shipping. So Dungarvan in trade terms was never going to compete as a port with Waterford or indeed Youghal. The adventurers moving on into this lovely broad valley to the west would have noticed that while it was very fertile, it didn't have a major river. And as they moved westwards towards Youghal, they would have seen that the big river Blackwater makes an abrupt right angle turn at Cappoquin and enters the sea at Youghal. And that was to have an influence on the development of both of these contemporaneous towns. In about 1200, the King of the Decies surrendered the cantrip of Dungarvan to King John, and the crown eventually accumulated an estate of about 81,000 hectares, forming the royal manor of Dungarvan. And this needed an administrative centre. So they created a castle on the south bank of the River Colligan at its narrowest point, but the estuary was still too wide to bridge it, so it was probably crossed by a ferry. It was a marvelous stone castle, but the groundwater conditions were saline, and to create drinking water, they actually created a cistern on the roof of the castle. The town was strategically located at the estuary, and also those two roads that you see coming in from the west linked the town to its very fertile agricultural hinterland. If Dungarvan wasn't going to be a trading centre, it had the advantage of very rich sea fishing grounds called the Nymph Bank, which are located off the counties Waterford and Cork. And from the very earliest days in the 13th century, Dungarvan, its main pillar of the economy was sea fishing, and they exported hake both to England and later on to the continent. And as we'll see in time, the export of hake both within Ireland and the continent became even more important in terms of the development of the town, with development of a fishing quarter called Boreen at Troa. Just departing briefly from the theme of water, given that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Irish Walled Towns Network, Dungarvan was a walled town in the 17th and 18th centuries, although all the walls had virtually disappeared by about 1800. And archaeological excavations since the 1990s have shown that the route didn't follow, that the walls did indeed follow the line as shown on that 1760 map on the left-hand side. The area enclosed was about 6 hectares, which is only 1/3 the size of Youghal, for example. So, and there was a main gate there leading westwards into the market area of the town and connecting, as I say, with its rural hinterland. There were 4 bastion towers at the 4 corners, and of course, as you see, the castle strategically located there on the top right-hand corner. But all the walls had effectively disappeared by the beginning of the 19th century. So returning to the theme of water, particularly the confluence of the sea and the river. As I've said, the estuary was very, very shallow, and this image of Dungarvan from the late 17th century shows that ships were actually beached at low tide. There were only 2 very small, inadequate piers. One served the castle, the other served the town itself. But despite this, the harbour did actually serve to export or transport produce from the area, particularly early potatoes, up to the Dublin market, and that was very important certainly in the 18th century. However, Dungarvan suffered very greatly during the Munster Wars and during the 17th century. Urban corporations were founded by King James I in 1609 in both Youghal and in Dungarvan, whereas in Youghal, the corporation survived and was very active in promoting the quays, and as a trading centre. The corporation in Dungarvan seems to have gone into abeyance around 1680, and as a result of that, there was very little port development. So in 1611, a customs official called Richard Cogan described Dungarvan as a very poor fisher town. notwithstanding the wealth generated by the hake industry in particular. Another recurring problem for Dungarvan, as more peaceful conditions developed in the 18th century and the population began to grow and the town expanded beyond the medieval town, was the lack of a decent water supply. As I've mentioned, the groundwater within the town, particularly within the medieval town, was brackish. So to supply a greater drinking water supply, they appealed to the Irish House of Commons in the 1750s to pipe water from the River Finnisk, which is about a mile or two west of Dungarvan. The Irish Parliament granted a sum of money towards this, but there was some dispute with the landers en route who actually blocked the water. So there was that became a recurring problem. Right into the 19th century, even after the establishment of the town commissioners in the 1850s, water was brought by barrel from springs to the west of town and distributed. When the Duke of Devonshire began to develop the town in the early 19th century, a well was sunk in the new Devonshire Square, now Grattan Square, but I don't know whether the water supply was suitable or not. But it was not until the very end of the 19th century that a new water supply was developed outside the town and brought in. But even then, there were recurring problems about water pressure. As I've mentioned, there was no bridge in medieval times. So people coming from Waterford, for example, had the option of using the only route, which is kind of a long bypass shown in red there. If they took the shorter route shown in blue, they would have had the option of crossing by ferry or possibly a ford at low tide. The Duke of Devonshire was the major landowner in the town, and he came under pressure to build a bridge in the early 19th century. The reason for his doing so was that Dungarvan retained one seat in the new, under the Act of Union in Westminster. So to curry favour with the voters, the Duke built this bridge in 1816 at enormous expense, which linked the town with the suburb of Abbeyside. And that greatly facilitated connections between Dungarvan and Waterford City, which was the administrative centre of the county until about 1900. Borina Troy, which is the little road of the sea, was a fishing quarter from probably the 17th or 18th century onwards. As shown on one of the maps from the 18th century, it was a collection of cottages, fishermen's cottages, with a route leading down to the sea where they launched their fishing boats. The important point was that those little houses had, as you can see, very, very long back gardens. Now, the Duke, again, as part of his urban renewal programme, redeveloped the housing in Borina Troy to accommodate people who had been displaced when Devonshire Square was built. So it became a denser settlement. The houses were of better quality in terms they were of brick and slate instead of mud cabins, but you notice that the gardens were much, much smaller, and this was a source of great grief to the fishermen because they depended on being able to grow subsistence crops, and the gardens simply weren't big enough for that purpose. Nonetheless, sea fisheries were extremely important in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 18th centuries, for example, there was a time in the 1720s when Dungarvan was exporting about 90,000 hake a year, notwithstanding the very poor conditions in the harbour itself. And in the early 19th century, it is estimated that about 5,000 people in Dungarvan depending on the fishing industry, either catching it or sorting fish and so on. But they were highly dependent on government bounties. And when these were drawn in 1830, there was virtually a collapse in the sea fishing industry. The other thing was the use of water was there had been a number of breweries and small distilleries in Dungarvan, but there were two major breweries developed in the 19th century. One at St. Bridget's Well, and you can actually see the well there that they drew their sauce from. This became a cider factory later on in the 20th century. The other link with the sea was, of course, the sea bathing industry, which developed very much in the 19th century as greater lodging houses and more hotels were built, and also purpose-built baths. There are small Turkish baths that were developed in the late century, 19th century, and then the town council built more baths in the 20th century. And the arrival of the railway, of course, in 1779 brought a lot of day trippers as well. So this became a new part of Dungarvan's economy. So just to wrap up, the water supply has been a continuing problem. They need to, the town's population has virtually doubled in the 20th century. So they've constantly had to build new water supplies, such as this water tower. The sea fishing industry has virtually vanished. There's some small leisure vessels in the harbour. There's virtually no commercial trade because the port is too shallow for that. Sea bathing is still a very important part of the economy. And even though the railway itself is closed, the Greenway has added very much to Dungarvan's attractions. There's no major distillery or brewery in Dungarvan, but there's still a kind of a flourishing micro brewery. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, John. So the cider factory was using water out of St. Bridget's Well. That's what the cider is made out of. Okay, excellent. Very good. We know for sponsorship, perhaps for next year, we can look into that. So to move on to our next paper, it's a pleasure to welcome Andrew Wilson from Bradford University. Andrew has a background in heritage and archaeology and conservation, and is involved in a team that has won many awards, including in 2021, the Queen's Anniversary Award, which is the highest academic award in the UK. And he's going to speak to us today about Derry and Kilmallock. And I think I'm right in saying that this research draws on work and studies that were done, partly funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council as part of the Ireland UK research scheme. Andrew, thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely warm welcome. And not content with talking about two Irish walled towns, I'm also going to mention Bradford, because actually the title of the project is the project that this is reporting on was Kilmallock, Derry and Bradford, north-south Irish walled towns and UK cities of culture, because of course Derry was the first UK city of culture and we are currently the UK city of culture. And water is something that is intricately woven into the fabric of our own city, Bradford. So I lead our capabilities in visualizing heritage, really looking at the use of 3D digital documentation methods. Those offer us a real opportunity to pick up on townscape heritage in really new, insightful ways. And as a consequence of using 3D technologies, of course, topography is a byproduct of what we're using. And our own city, Bradford, that you see here represented in this mobile mapping data, actually is a watershed environment. It has tributaries, the Bradford becks that give Bradford its name, the Broad Ford, that disappear actually beneath the city, out of view. And I think this is a really interesting and fundamental aspect of a refocus in attention that we see these days when we think about that potential for townscape heritage, not just for regeneration, not just as we've heard today, those climate challenges, but also that benefit of blue-green infrastructure around health and well-being. It's something we see in Bradford. It's something I know that Sarah, who's going to be talking to you later about Limerick, has been implementing in Kilmallock. So connecting place-based humanities research through the historic environment and using that vehicle of digital documentation to do so. A very brief explanation then of the use of digital twin technologies. What we were posed as a challenge by our own local authority in Bradford. And this is a work that has been engaged with the local authority in Limerick and in Derry, was really to see this multitude of ways in which we can approach a city or a town in different directions. As a heritage professional, I'm interested in the creative elements, the tourism, the education, the interpretation. But though you flip that same coin and you are looking at data-driven decision making, you're looking at urban planning, regeneration, architectural design. And when we see, of course, a city like Derry, water at its core in terms of the development of that core, the island of Derry, and also, as we see with the Peace Bridge here, how it has transformed that approach in terms of boundaries. It's revisited some of the challenging histories. And of course, that connects Derry, the island of Derry, with Ibrington Barracks, that of course was up until relatively recently underdeveloped as an asset, and now is a fundamental element of Derry's identity. This was an image, a 360 image that we developed as part of the work we were doing, both in Derry and in Kilmallock. And it's a reminder, of course, that, as we've heard earlier this morning, that some of the techniques that we use in order to develop our 3D representations, and this is the island of Derry as a 3D model on Sketchfab, and a preview of that you can reflect on yourself and use yourself. And what we're doing is we're using sub 250 gram drones. That places us in the remit of urban environments actually being able to be captured at pace, at scale, and using overlapping imagery that provides us this structure from motion photogrammetry. The little hotspots that are on the model itself provide that narrative. What are the key features? What are those elements that we are wanting to draw attention to? So some of our work was from the air. Some of it was also at ground level. So we had a partnership with Leica that you could see Stephen here from Leica using the Pegasus backpack system to walk the Derry walls. And in addition to that, we also had vehicle mounted systems as well. It is just a cycleway and a pedestrian route, the Peace Bridge. But of course, that method of capture provides a really valuable route to joining, connecting that understanding of place. I mentioned that we also have vehicle mounted systems. So for both Derry and Kilmallock, and this is a vehicle with our TRK Leica system mounted on it, emerging from Blossom Gate in Kilmallock. And although we're still working on that data sets, a flavour of what this offers is seen here with our own World Heritage Site in Saltaire in Bradford. This is rich data classified at the point of capture. It tells us buildings, green space, greenery, cars, street furniture and the like. You can turn off each of those layers individually, and it is therefore a really powerful tool in terms of that way forwards for our understanding of townscape heritage. A little bit like Google Street View on steroids, some of the technology that we use. These mosaic cameras, again, providing that ground level view of the city in its detail. Now, it's not the first time, of course, that sites like Derry have been captured. Back in response to the 400th anniversary of Derry and its City of Culture accolade, the walls themselves were surveyed by the Discovery Programme. And what we are able to do, and this is an illustration of that, is place some of that work in context. So some of the high resolution scans that it took several weeks to capture back in 2013, we have been able to reposition into that comprehensive model. So different epochs of data capture, of course, mirror what we see historically with maps. These are places that evolve, that transform with time. And although Thomas Raven's map of 1622 shows Derry and, of course, the very significant prominence of the Foyle, that is a fold in the map. It is not the bridge that, of course, came in the 18th century. But it does emphasize what we can do in terms of the layering of information. Of course, much of that land, the slobs, as it was called, on the inner bank of the meander of the Foyle, of course, that muddy ground giving rise to the potential for reclaiming land. And as we go through, of course, other maps, the Neville map from 1689, again, we still have no bridge. The prominence in terms of that city development with a ferry crossing seen within the street names that lead down to the southwest. And we can again overlay our 3D data in this. And what you're seeing is a preview of what we will be releasing using Esri Experience Builder as a route to understanding that historic context to what we are presenting. Of course, another element that we see is a shift. Finally, we have our bridge in the Sampson and Porter map from 1799, but we also see this shift in focus in terms of where the administrative heart of this planned city shifts. It shifts from the Diamond, the central town hall, down to the port, to that reclaimed land, to the Guildhall, hastened, of course, by the 1905 fire that destroyed the historic town hall. Again, showing that in context with the present-day base maps. If we shift to Kilmallock, of course, again, we did capture from the air, from the ground, and you're seeing the very traditional medieval streetscape preserved, so much earlier than Derry, preserved in terms of the burgage plots, preserved in terms of the 4 national monuments that are present within the town, including the 13th century Dominican priory and the collegiate church, and of course sites like St. John's Castle, one of the gateways that you see through on the right here. I have to give a big shout out to our colleagues. Caroline here, Caroline Williamson, was a fantastic researcher on the project, working very closely with Sarah McCutcheon and with Katrina Becker, looking at how that historic information, maps, documentary sources, archive records, could be augmented with the intangible, those records that came from narratives from the local community, and a big focus on Kilmallock for that, but similar work with community groups when in Derry. And again, we can use that 3D data not simply to, of course, point to the development of the town, the priory to the right there, but also the riverscape that sits outside the town walls, but is fundamentally important, of course, in terms of the positioning of the priory. And water has its role in other ways because, of course, we have a very significant medieval fish lake to the west of the town. And as we sort of overlay our representation, our 3D representation of the town, present day, of course, the river is very visible in that. Interesting that, of course, that the Dominican Priory should be built on a floodplain. Interesting that magnetometry that we attempted, but of course the ground was very wet in May last year, so the silage hadn't been cut at the time we were there, so we had to rely on magnetometry data from James Bonsall to finish the job. But we're able to look at how historically the couple of watermills that you see here actually are reflective of canalisation and a diversion of the meanders from the original river course. The river significant, of course, in terms of the fundamental bridges into and out of this town in its strategic position between Cork and Limerick, of course. So I'll leave it there for now. But of course, this is a representation of work across a number of institutions. And I should also point out that in the network phase that was the precursor to this, we also were working with NUIG as well as UCC. But a lot of the team shown there from our work from last year. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. And moving on then to our fourth and final speaker in this session, it's a pleasure to introduce a graduate of the Department of History at Maynooth University, Vincent Delaney, who did his thesis under the late Raymond Gillespie, former chair of our board here in the IHTA. Vincent has worked on 18th and 19th century Roscommon in particular, but he's also published widely on nautical and architectural history. But today he's going to focus on Roscommon, a town with no river.
Good morning. County town of Roscommon in the barony of Ballintubber is sited without the benefit of a river. Most of County Roscommon has carboniferous limestone close to the surface. The layout of the town area is dominated by a turlock called Loch Nanain. And when the turlock overflows, there is a small brook, which from time to time carries the water away to the River Suck and eventually to the River Shannon, 45 kilometres to the south. An ecclesiastical settlement of canons regular was established by a disciple of St. Finian of Clonard called Coman or Comans in about 540 AD at the base of a shallow incline below the Thurlock. Fresh water supply for the settlement came from a well, which after St. Coman's death became a holy well known as Davach Comon or Coman's Vat. In the 1140s, the monastery, then under the patronage of Thurlock O'Connor, adopted the Augustinian rule, and a fragment of the true cross was presented to the monastery by its patron, and the fragment was enshrined in the Cross of Common. From then on, Roscommon became a great place of pilgrimage. A Dominican priory was built in 1253, similar to those at Sligo and Athenry. It was founded by Phelim O'Connor and built a short distance to the south of the monastic settlement, and it too was serviced by a nearby well. Over time, regular markets took place in the land located between the two monasteries. In 1269, Anglo-Normans built a substantial royal castle, stone fortress, on Dominican-owned lands as a permanent footing for the English in Connacht. The fortress was built with 3-metre thick walls at the edge of the Thurlock, at the top of the slope above St. Coman's Monastery, utilising the Thurlock to form a wet fosse to withstand any attacks from the native Irish. The Thurlock provided the water supply for the huge castle. The O'Connor clan had a residence close to the priory, and Kieran O'Connor believes that the large Crannog on Loch Nane belonged to the O'Connor clan. In 1304, John de Exeter was paid 5 marks to make a conduit for the water of St. Bridget's Well to carry it to a lake underneath the castle. In about 1300, King Edward I granted a charter of incorporation for the growing town of Roscommon, and it was renewed in 1310 by King Edward II. They all got lost, of course, but King James I granted the inhabitants a charter of incorporation in 1613 as the borough of Roscommon, with entitlements to send 2 representatives to Parliament. By 1445, the Dominican priory had fallen into disrepair, so Pope Eugene IV granted a bull to encourage the faithful to support its rebuilding. With a tower in the church and a new east window and the renovation of the cloister, the halls, the cellars, orchards, gardens, and refectories. The dissolution of the monasteries and the theft of all their valuables occurred in the 1540s, and the Roscommon lands and buildings were awarded to Sir Nicholas de Maltby, governor of Connaught, in 1578. As part of the deal, Maltby was required to build an English town for planters and settlers. However, the walled town was never constructed. Instead, Maltby renovated the old castle as his own personal residence in the form of a large Elizabethan semi-fortified dwelling in the style of Athlumney Castle or Burncourt Castle. Short distance to the south of the castle, there was a well. Houses were built around the well, forming a market square. By 1609, the castle had been burned, but the town proceeded to grow, with houses built on sites up to 70 foot wide, with long back gardens, all on the axis of the castle. In time, a town gate was built at the bottom of the hill to separate the English settlers in their 2-story high thatched houses from their Irish counterparts. Most still depended on the well in the market square, which, although 50 feet deep, did not maintain a reliable water supply. Over town, better quality houses installed their own wells. In about 1670, the town proprietor, the Earl of Ranelagh, had designed and built a market house with a sessions house upstairs, similar to those of Kinsale, Cahir, or Kildare. That building collapsed in 1719 due to overcrowding, with a great loss of life. It was rebuilt by John and George Ensor in the 1760s, but by that time the whole Many of the wide house sites on the main street had been subdivided several times. The map of the town shows English town with substantial houses and Irish town with cottages bereft of windows and chimneys. The town survived on agriculture, fattening cattle, sheep, growing flax, weaving linen, and pottery, with regular town markets. The maintenance of law and order was reinforced in 1703 by the building of a military barracks a short distance outside the town on the west side, with its own pump to lift the water up from deep underground. After buildings of St. Colman's Monastery had been demolished, the stones and doorways were reused for the 1770 Church of Ireland building on the same site. A new jail was built in the market square at the expense of the landlords and rented to Lord Crofton for the sum of 1 shilling a year in 1793. And it too had its own pumped well and cesspit. In 1708, the Earl of Renil, the proprietor of the town, granted funds for the building of 4 schools, 2 in Roscommon town and 2 in Athlone town, for the education of Protestant boys and girls. Roscommon schools were built in the 1760s. They are located a short distance north of the town. It's funny how everything just happened just outside the town, but that's the way that the town developed. Proprietorship of the town passed to the Earls of Essex and the Barons of Ross, neither of which owned a residence in Roscommon. The only substantial development by these landlords was the building of Essex Street. In 1807, the land for that street was let to stonemasons, labourers, thatchers, and so on condition that they built good quality detached houses to an approved design. However, the houses, although they did have windows and chimneys, they had no water supply and no sewerage. An infirmary of 50 beds was built at the expense of Mrs. Caulfield in 1783, along with the house for the surgeon in Abbeytown, close to the ruined Dominican Priory. However, lack of proper sanitary facilities resulted in outbreaks of cholera, including that in 1832, when 86 people caught the disease and 29 died. By the time the Ordnance Survey map of the town was prepared, the town was well developed in every respect, except for its water supply, which failed from time to time, particularly in the summer. The Ordnance Survey letters refer to Loch Nonane being drained with pipes, which would have lowered the general water table, thus making many of the private wells less than satisfactory. That 1837 Ordnance map highlights the importance of maintaining law and order. The courthouse in the town square had been sold to the parish priest for use as a Catholic church in 1829, and a new courthouse built. The old jail at Market Square was put to use as a lunatic asylum, and a new larger jail built in 1820 on the Panopticon model, with 91 cells and a tread wheel. It had its own sewage treatment and pumped well. The workhouse was built a short distance away from the town to the southeast in the 1840s, with accommodation for 900 inmates. It had its own wells and its own cesspits, and the original drawings appear to indicate the rainwater from the roofs was collected into tanks for reuse. In the early 19th century, of the 581 town houses, 400 were mere mud cabins with thatched roofs. Samuel Lewis notes the inhabitants are but indifferently supplied with water from deep well in the center of the town. A great fire started in the courthouse in 14th of June 1882. There was no fire brigade, no fire engine, and no water available. 16 houses and the courthouse were all destroyed. Was this just the stimulus to improve the water supply? In 1889, the local government board and the local board of guardians, who were the sanitary authority for Roscommon, could not agree on who should provide a safe water supply. Mr. O'Brien Smith, local government inspector, was engaged at Roscommon to inquire into the sufficiency and stability of a scheme supplying the town with water. Although Roscommon holds an important position as an assize town in the county, it has hitherto been in a deplorable condition owing to its want of water supply. The sewerage works, which when completed will have cost £900, are rendered totally useless if there's no water to flush out the pipes. The proposed water scheme, for which a loan of £5,000 is sought, is somewhat different from the usual character of waterworks for a town like Roscommon. The plan is described by Mr. Christopher Mulvaney, County Surveyor. The supply is to be taken from 2 springs at Ballinagard to the south of the town and to be conveyed by gravitation in stoneware pipes 800 yards lineal to a point near a mill where it is proposed to erect pumps. The pumps will force the spring water through 9-inch rising pipes to the summit of the hill to the north of the town. There, a reservoir will be constructed holding 30 days' supply. The height of the water of the high street level will be 108 feet. The quantity of water available for the 2 springs will allow 20 gallons per head for a population of 2,000 people. The distance to the pumps, the reservoir, is 6,400 yards. The total estimate for the works is £3,600. In 1900, discussions were still ongoing between Roscommon District Council and the owners of land between Rockfield and the town, with a view to getting a safe water supply. And as late as 1911, the chairman of Roscommon Town Commissioners noted, "We all know that the sanitary arrangements in Roscommon are not in good condition." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Vincent. So if I could ask our 4 speakers to come up and take the stage, please. I feel as though I should do the customary speed dating 1-line recap of what each person has spoken about. Linda talked about George Clooney and New Ross. John about the Holy Cider in Dungarvan. Andrew, I think, spoke about Google Street View on steroids. And then finally, we had Vincent just now on the town with no river. So if there are any questions from the floor, we'll take those now. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda, my heart is still racing from that presentation. I'm from Thomastown, County Kilkenny, the highest part of the navigation of that wonderful economic corridor. 2 questions. 1, can I have 5 minutes of your time at lunch? Number 2 question. Is it true that the merchants of Bristol would have financed, let's say, the Norman invasion, and they took headage out of a lot of the commerce going downriver? And that there is an archive in the University of Bristol. Is that true?
Certainly there are connections with Bristol, but the funding, I don't know, I'm afraid. I don't know if somebody else might know, I don't know.
Thank you very much. That's our first setup now, 5 minutes at lunchtime. Anybody else with any questions or observations? Yes.
Question for, bear with me, the Derry and Bradford talk. In terms of the data that was captured, you mentioned community narratives, and you also showed what looked like kind of heavily layered modeling system. I'm curious about 2 things. One is a general question, is taking the jargon out of it, just in layperson's terms, that information and capture that you showed, how is that going to be translated and made accessible to the public? In what ways? Just to kind of a general sense of that. It's just very interesting. And the other thing that struck me was what kind of resources are being given to it in terms of data input and how much information. Just not really sure the context. And then I don't know if I asked this already, the community aspect and the narratives, how is that being captured and layered into it? Are you talking about text-based information? Are you talking about audio files? Just could you give us a sense of that?
Thanks very much for those questions. Some really, really important, that one turn off. Yeah, is that working? Okay, so the value of the 3D data sets is there as an anchor point. It's an anchor point that we can layer different types of information. I showed you two types of information. One was the previous scans that had been captured by the Discovery Programme as hotspots. And the other were some initial descriptors of place-based heritage assets. The intangible that I think you were driving at in terms of key narratives came from a series of community-focused workshops, both primarily in Kilmallock, but we also had some community-focused narratives collecting information from community groups in Derry. And they cover a range of things, as you say, audio, written, photographic, even within Kilmallock, homeowners allowing us to come in, photograph, sketch, draw those bits of buildings information in terms of the development of a structure that are not present, not visible from the streetscape, not in any records. So it's all of that, and then you've got all the legal documents. You've got other things that serve as traditional documentary sources. What we're going to be using is something called Experience Builder. It's a product within Esri's suite of tools. Esri is, as many of you know, one of the big providers of mapping information, and the valuable means of conveying that through Experience Builder is that it's multi-platform. So you can look at that same information, whether it's on a desktop computer or on a mobile phone. So it lends itself, and we've done it for Saltaire in Bradford, the World Heritage Site, lends itself to those self-guided tours, not necessarily information that you can cover in one go, but that's just one of those outlets that we envisage it being taken up by quite a large, diverse audience. That's the hope, and the plan is to have a couple of launch events focused towards Kilmallock and Derry that raise awareness further of this.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Anybody else? Yes.
Question for Linda. Is it no then by who disposal?
I think this may not be on.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, it is. Okay, it is. Thanks, Teresa. We don't have an absolute date for it, but we know from the life of William Marshall that he was probably in Ireland from around about 1200. And the first reference to it is in 1208. So sometime between 1200 and 1208, the bridge was constructed. It's certainly a noticeable feature by 1208 if they're kind of listing that grant to Tintern Abbey by using the bridge as a focal point. So it's something that people would be aware of. That's the first reference. Yes. No. But we would guess it must be there by the time they've used that as a location for the grant. Great, thanks very much.
Thank you. Just one moment, if you don't mind. Sorry.
They're working on it. Yeah. Question for John. Excuse me. What do you know what year the Turkish bath was opened in Dungarvan, and was it linked to kind of Richard Barter franchise or model in Turkish bath?
There was a kind of a craze for Turkish baths around the 1780s, 1780s. A huge one, for example, in Cork or in Bray. The one in Dungarvan was 1885 and it was relatively small by the standards of the day.
Thank you. Now there was another person. Yeah.
And on your
Can't hear you now. It was a division of authority between the people responsible. That, you know, the landlords were absentee landlords, so they didn't see any interest in improving the infrastructure. And then when the local authorities came, there was a division between the town authorities and the more regional authorities, and there was a division between the two, and neither could. So one of the biggest issues, in fact, was that if the regional authority was going to pay for the water scheme for the town, then the people who were not going to benefit from it were going to have to pay for it. And that was one of the big issues.
Okay, we have time for one more question or comment if anybody has one. I'm sure there'll be time over lunch break for you to all have your little confabs. So we're going to break for our lunch now. It's 12:15, and for those of you, I'm sure all of you coming back after lunch, please be here at 1:15. But before you go, please offer up your thanks again in the traditional way for Vincent, Linda, John, and Andrew. And thank you very much.